We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson, Chapter 5. When I came into the kitchen, still trailing mist from the creek, Constance was arranging Uncle Julian's breakfast tray. Uncle Julian was clearly feeling well this morning, since Constance was giving him tea instead of hot milk. He must have awakened early and asked for tea. I went to her and put my arms around her, and she turned and hugged me. "Good morning, my Merricat," she said. "Good morning, my Constance. Is Uncle Julian better today?" "Much, much better. And the sun is going to shine after yesterday's rain. And I am going to make a chocolate mousse for your dinner, my Merricat." "I love you, Constance." "And I love you. Now, what will you have for breakfast?" "Pancakes, little tiny hot ones, and 2 fried eggs. Today my winged horse is coming, and I am carrying you off to the moon, and on the moon we will eat rose petals." "Some rose petals are poisonous." "Not on the moon. Is it true that you can plant a leaf?" "Some leaves. Furred leaves. You can put them in water, and they grow roots, and then you plant them, and they grow into a plant. The kind of a plant they were when they started, of course, not just any plant." I'm sorry about that. Good morning, Jonas. You are a furred leaf, I think." "Silly Merricat." "I like a leaf that grows into a different plant, all furry." Constance was laughing. "Uncle Julian will never get his breakfast if I listen to you," she said. She took up the tray and went into Uncle Julian's room. "Hot tea coming," she said. "Constance, my dear, a glorious morning, I think. A splendid day to work." "And to sit in the sun." Jonas sat in the sunlight doorway, washing his face. I was hungry. Perhaps it would be kind to Uncle Julian today if I put a feather on the lawn at the spot where Uncle Julian's chair would go. I was not allowed to bury things in the lawn. On the moon, we wore feathers in our hair and rubies on our hands. On the moon, we had gold spoons. "Perhaps today is a good day to begin a new chapter, Constance?" "Yes, Uncle Julian." "Do you think I should begin chapter 44 today?" "Of course." "Some of the early pages need a little brushing up. A work like this is never done." "Shall I brush your hair?" "I think I will brush it myself this morning, thank you. A man's head should be his own responsibility after all." "I have no jam." "Shall I get you some?" "No, because I see that I have somehow eaten all my toast." "I fancy a broiled liver for my lunch, Constance." "You shall have it. Shall I take your tray?" "Yes, thank you, and I will brush my hair." Constance came back into the kitchen and set down the tray. "And now for you, my Merricat," she said. "And Jonas." "Jonas had his breakfast long ago." "Will you plant a leaf for me?" "One of these days." She turned her head and listened. "He's still asleep," she said. "Who is still asleep?" "Will I watch it grow?" "Cousin Charles is still asleep," she said, and the day fell apart around me. I saw Jonas in the doorway and Constance by the stove, but they had no color. I could not breathe. I was tied around tight. Everything was cold. "He was a ghost," I said. Constance laughed, and it was a sound very far away. "Then a ghost is sleeping in Father's bed," she said, "and ate a very hearty dinner last night while you were gone," she said. "I dreamed that he came. I fell asleep on the ground and dreamed that he came, but then I dreamed him away. I was held tight. When Constance believed me, I could breathe again. We talked for a long time last night. Go and look, I said, not breathing. Go and look, he isn't there. Silly Merricat, she said. I could not run. I had to help Constance. I took my glass and smashed it on the floor. Now he'll go away, I said. Constance came to the table and sat down across me, looking very serious. I wanted to go around the table and hug her, but she still had no color. My Mary Cat, she said slowly. Cousin Charles is here. He is our cousin. As long as his father was alive, that was Arthur Blackwood, father's brother. Cousin Charles could not come to us or try to help us because his father would not allow him. His father, she said and smiled a little, thought very badly of us. He refused to take care of you during the trial. Did you know that? And he never let our names be mentioned in his house. Then why do you mention his name in our house? Because I'm trying to explain. As soon as his father died, Cousin Charles hurried here to help us. How can he help us? We're very happy. Aren't we, Constance? Very happy, Merricat, but please be pleasant to Cousin Charles. I could breathe a little. It was going to be all right. Cousin Charles was a ghost, but a ghost that could be driven away. He'll go away, I said. I don't suppose he plans to stay forever, Constance said. He only came for a visit after all. I would have to find something, a device, to use against him. Has Uncle Julian seen him? Uncle Julian knows he's here, but Uncle Julian was too unwell last night to leave his room. He had his dinner on a tray, only a little soup. I was glad he asked for tea this morning. Today we eat in the house. Later, after Cousin Charles is awake, and I'd better sweep up that broken glass before he comes down. I watched her while she swept up the glass. Today would be a glittering day, full of tiny, sparkling things. There was no point in hurrying with my breakfast because today I could not go out until we had eaten in the house, so I lingered, drinking milk slowly and watching Jonas. Before I was finished, Uncle Julian called Constance to come and help him into his chair, and she brought him into the kitchen and put him by his table and his papers. I think I shall commence chapter 44, he said, putting his hands together. I shall commence, I think, with a slight exaggeration, and go on from there into an outright lie. Constance, my dear. Yes, Uncle Julian. I am going to say that my wife was beautiful. Then we were all silent for a minute, puzzled by the sound of a foot stepping upstairs where there had always been silence before. It was unpleasant, this walking overhead. Constance always stepped lightly, and Uncle Julian never walked. This footstep was heavy and even and bad. That is Cousin Charles, Constance said, looking up. Indeed, said Uncle Julian. He carefully arranged a paper before him and took up a pencil. I am anticipating considerable pleasure from the society of my brother's son, he said. Perhaps you can fill in some details on the behavior of his family during the trial, although, I confess, I have somewhere set down notes on a possible conversation they might have had. He turned to one of his notebooks. This will delay chapter 44, I suspect. I took Jonas and went to my corner, and Constance went into the hall to meet Charles when he came down the stairs. Good morning, Cousin Charles, she said. Good morning, Connie. It was the same voice as he had used last night. I got further into my corner as she brought him into the kitchen, and Uncle Julian touched his papers and turned to face the doorway. Uncle Julian, I am pleased to meet you at last. Charles, you are Arthur's son, but you resemble my brother John, who is dead. Arthur's dead too. That's why I'm here. He died wealthy, I trust. I was the only brother with no knack for money. As a matter of fact, Uncle Julian, my father left nothing. A pity. His father left a considerable sum. It came to a considerable sum, even divided among the three of us. I always knew my share would melt away, but I had not suspected it of my brother Arthur. Perhaps your mother was an extravagant woman? I do not remember her very clearly. I recall that when my niece Constance wrote to her uncle during the trial, it was his wife who answered, requesting that the family connection be severed. I wanted to come before, Uncle Julian. I dare say, youth is always curious, and a woman of such notoriety as your cousin Constance would present a romantic figure to a young man. Constance? Yes, Uncle Julian. Have I had my breakfast? Yes. I will have another cup of tea then. This young man and I have a great deal to discuss. I still could not see him clearly. Perhaps because he was a ghost. Perhaps because he was so very big. His great round face, looking so much like our father's, turned from Constance to Uncle Julian and back, smiling and opening its mouth to talk. I moved as far into my corner as I could, but finally the big face turned at me. Why, there's Mary, it said. Good morning, Mary. I put my face down to Jonas. Shy? He asked Constance. Never mind. Kids always take to me. Constance laughed. Well, we don't see many strangers, she said. She was not at all awkward or uncomfortable. It was as though she hadn't been expecting all her life that Cousin Charles would come, as though she had planned exactly what to do and say, almost as though in the house of her life there'd always been a room kept for Cousin Charles. He stood up and came closer to me. That's a handsome cat, he said. Does it have a name? Jonas and I looked at him, and then I thought that Jonas's name might be the safest thing to speak to him first. Jonas, I said. Jonas? Is he your special pet? Yes, I said. We looked at him, Jonas and I, not daring to blink or look away. The big white face was close, still looking like our father, and the big mouth was smiling. We're going to be friends, you and Jonas and I, he said. What will you have for breakfast? Constance asked him, and she smiled at me because I had told him Jonas's name. Whatever you're serving, he said, turning away from me at last. Merricat had pancakes. Pancakes would be great. A good breakfast and charming company on a beautiful day. What more could I ask? Pancakes, observed Uncle Julian, are an honored dish in this family. Although I rarely take them myself, my health permits only the lightest and daintiest foods. Pancakes were served for breakfast on that last... Uncle Julian, Constance said, your papers are spilling on the floor. Let me get them, sir. Cousin Charles kneeled to get the papers, and Constance said, After breakfast, you'll see my garden. A chivalrous young man, Uncle Julian said, accepting his papers from Charles. I thank you. I am not able myself to leap across a room and kneel on the floor, and I am gratified to find someone who can. I believe that you are a year or so older than my niece. I'm 32, Charles said, and Constance is approximately 28. We long ago gave up the practice of birthdays, but 28 should be about right, Constance. I should not be talking so on an empty stomach. Where's my breakfast? You finished it an hour ago, Uncle Julian. I'm making you a cup of tea and pancakes for Cousin Charles. Charles is intrepid. Your cooking, although it is of a very high standard indeed, has certain disadvantages. I'm not afraid to eat anything Constance cooks, Charles said. Really? Said Uncle Julian. I congratulate you. I was referring to the effect a weighty meal like pancakes is apt to have on a delicate stomach. I suppose your reference was to arsenic. Come and have your breakfast, Constance said. I was laughing, although Jonas hid my face. It took Charles a good half-minute to pick up his fork, and he kept smiling at Constance. Finally, knowing that Constance and Uncle Julian and Jonas and I were watching him, he cut off a small piece of pancake and brought it to his mouth, but he could not bring himself to put it inside. Finally, he set the fork with the piece of pancake down on his plate and turned to Uncle Julian. You know, I was thinking, he said, maybe while I'm here there are things I could do for you. Dig in the garden, maybe, or run errands. I'm pretty good at hard work. You had dinner here last night and woke up alive this morning, Constance said. I was laughing, but she suddenly looked almost cross. What? Charles said. Oh! He looked down at his fork as though he had forgotten it, and at last he picked it up and put the piece of pancake into his mouth very quickly, and chewed it and swallowed it and looked up at Constance. Delicious, he said, and Constance smiled. Constance? Yes, Uncle Julian? I think I shall not, after all, begin chapter 44 this morning. I think I shall go back to chapter 17, where I recall that I made some slight mention of your cousin and his family and their attitude during the trial. Charles, you are a clever young man. I am eager to hear your story. It was all so long ago, Charles said. You should have kept notes, Uncle Julian said. I mean, Charles said, can it all be forgotten? There's no point in keeping those memories alive. Forgotten? Uncle Julian said. Forgotten? It was a sad and horrible time, and it's not going to do Connie here any good at all to keep talking about it. Young man, you are speaking slightingly, I believe, of my work. A man does not take his work lightly. A man has his work to do, and he does it. Remember that, Charles. I'm just saying that I don't want to talk about Connie and that bad time. I shall be forced to invent, to fictionalize, to imagine. I refuse to discuss it any further. Constance? Yes, Uncle Julian? Constance looked very serious. It did happen. I remember that it happened, said Uncle Julian, fingers at his mouth. Constance hesitated, and then she said, Of course it did, Uncle Julian. My notes. Uncle Julian's voice trailed off, and he gestured at his papers. Yes, Uncle Julian, it was real. I was angry because Charles ought to be kind to Uncle Julian. I remember that today was the day of sparkles and light, and I thought that I would find something bright and pretty to put near Uncle Julian's chair. Constance? Yes? May I go outside? Am I warm enough? I think so, Uncle Julian. Constance was sorry, too. Uncle Julian was shaking his head back and forth sadly, and he had put down his pencil. Constance went into Uncle Julian's room and brought out a shawl, which she put around his shoulders very gently. Charles was eating his pancakes bravely now, and did not look up. I wondered if he cared that he had not been kind to Uncle Julian. Now you will go outside, Constance said quietly to Uncle Julian, and the sun will be warm, and the garden will be bright, and you will have broiled liver for your lunch. Perhaps not, Uncle Julian said. Perhaps I had better just have an egg. Constance wheeled him gently to the door and eased his chair carefully down the step. Charles looked up from his pancakes, but when he started to rise to help her, she shook her head. I'll put you in your special corner, she said to Uncle Julian, where I can see you every minute, and 5 times an hour I'll wave hello to you. We could hear her talking all the time she was wheeling Uncle Julian to his corner. Jonas left me and went to sit in the doorway and watch them. Jonas, Charles said, and Jonas turned toward him. Cousin Mary doesn't like me. Charles said to Jonas. I disliked the way he was talking to Jonas, and I disliked the way Jonas appeared to be listening to him. How can I make Cousin Mary like me? Charles said, and Jonas looked quickly at me and then back up to Charles. Here I've come to visit my 2 dear cousins, Charles said. My 2 dear cousins and my old uncle whom I haven't seen for years, and my Cousin Mary won't even be polite to me. What do you think, Jonas? There were sparkles at the sink, where a drop of water was swelling to fall. Perhaps if I held my breath until the drop fell, Charles would go away. But I knew that was not true. Holding my breath was too easy. Oh, well, Charles said to Jonas. Constance likes me, and I guess that's all that matters. Constance came to the doorway, waited for Jonas to move, and when he did not, stepped over him. More pancakes? She said to Charles. No, thanks. I'm trying to get acquainted with my little cousin. It won't be long before she's fond of you. Constance was looking at me. Jonas had fallen to washing himself, and I thought at last of what to say. Today we meet in the house, I said. Uncle Julian slept all morning in the garden. Constance went off into the back bedroom windows to look down on him while we worked, and stood sometimes with the dust cloth in her hands, as though she were forgetting to come back and dust our mother's jewel box that held our mother's pearls, and her sapphire ring, and her brooch with diamonds. I looked out the window only once to see Uncle Julian with his eyes closed, and Charles standing nearby. It was ugly to think of Charles walking among the vegetables and under the apple trees and across the lawn where Uncle Julian slept. We'll let Father's room go this morning, Constance said, because Charles is living there. Some time later, she said, as though she'd been thinking about it, I wonder if it would be right for me to wear Mother's pearls. I've never worn pearls. They've always been in the box, I said. You'd have to take them out. It's not likely that anyone would care, Constance said. I would care if you looked more beautiful. Constance laughed and said, I'm silly now. Why should I want to wear pearls? They're better off in the box where they belong. Charles had closed the door of our father's room, so I could not look inside, but I wondered if he had moved our father's things, or put a hat or handkerchief or a glove on the dresser beside our father's silver brushes. I wondered if he had looked into the closet or into the drawers. Our father's room was in the front of the house, and I wondered if Charles had looked down from the windows and out over the lawn and the long driveway to the road, and wanted to be on that road and away home. How long did it take Charles to get here? I asked Constance. 4 or 5 hours, I think, she said. He came by bus to the village and had to walk from there. Then it will take him 4 or 5 hours to get home again? I suppose so, when he goes. But first he will have to walk back to the village? Unless you take him on your winged horse. I don't have any winged horse, I said. Oh, Merricat, Constance said. Charles is not a bad man. There were sparkles in the mirrors, and inside our mother's jewel box the diamonds and pearls were shining in the darkness. Constance made shadows up and down the hall when she went to the window to look down on Uncle Julian, and outside the new leaves moved quickly in the sunlight. Charles had only gotten in because the magic was broken. If I could reseal the protection around Constance and shut Charles out, he would have to leave the house. Every touch he made on the house must be erased. Charles is a ghost, I said, and Constance sighed. I polished the doorknob to our father's room with my dust cloth, and at least one of Charles's touches was gone. When we had neatened the upstairs room, we came downstairs together, carrying our dustcloths and the broom and dustpan and mop like a pair of witches walking home. In the drawing room, we dusted the golden-legged chairs and the harp, and everything sparkled at us, even the blue dress and the portrait of our mother. I dusted the wedding cake trim with a cloth on the end of a broom, staggering, and looking up and pretending that the ceiling was the floor, and I was sweeping, hovering busily in space, looking down at my broom, weightless and flying until the room swung dizzily, and I was again on the floor looking up. "Charles has not yet seen this room," Constance said. "Mother was so proud of it. I ought to have showed it to him right away." "May I have sandwiches for my lunch? I want to go down to the creek." "Sooner or later you're going to have to sit at the table with him, Merricat." "Tonight at dinner, I promise." We dusted the dining room and the silver tea service and the high wooden backs of the chairs. Constance went every few minutes into the kitchen to look out the back door and check on Uncle Julian. And once I heard her laugh and call, "Watch out for the mud down there." I knew she was talking to Charles. "Where did you let Charles sit last night at dinner?" I asked her once. "In Father's chair," she said. And then, "He has a perfect right to sit there. He's a guest, and he even looks like Father." "Will he sit there tonight?" "Yes, Merricat." I dusted our father's chair thoroughly, although it was small use if Charles was to sit there again tonight. I would have to clean all the silverware. When we had finished neatening the house, we went back to the kitchen. Charles was sitting at the kitchen table, smoking his pipe and looking at Jonas, who was looking back at him. The pipe smoke was disagreeable in our kitchen, and I disliked having Jonas look at Charles. Constance went on out the back door to get Uncle Julian, and we could hear him say, "Dorothy? I was not asleep, Dorothy." "Cousin Mary doesn't like me," Charles said again to Jonas. "I wonder if Cousin Mary knows how I get even with people who don't like me." "Can I help you with that chair, Constance?" "Have a nice nap, Uncle?" Constance made sandwiches for Jonas and me, and we ate them in a tree. I sat on a low fork, and Jonas sat on a small branch near me, watching for birds. "Jonas," I told him, "you are not to listen any more to Cousin Charles." And Jonas regarded me in wide-eyed astonishment that I should attempt to make decisions for him. "Jonas," I said, "he is a ghost." And Jonas closed his eyes and turned away. It was important to choose the exact device to drive Charles away. An imperfect magic, or one incorrectly used, might only bring more disaster upon our house. I thought of my mother's jewels, since this was a day of sparkling things, but they might not be strong on a dull day. And Constance would be angry if I took them out of the box where they belonged, when she herself had decided against it. I thought of books, which are always strongly protective, but my father's book had fallen from the tree and let Charles in. Books, then, were perhaps powerless against Charles. I lay back against the tree trunk and thought of magic. If Charles had not gone away before 3 days, I would smash the mirror in the hall. He sat across from me at dinner, and in our father's chair, with his big white face blotting out the silver on the sideboard behind him. He watched while Constance cut up Uncle Julian's chicken and put it correctly on the plate, and he watched when Uncle Julian took the first bite and turned it over and over in his mouth. "Here's a biscuit, Uncle Julian," Constance said. "Eat the soft inside." Constance had forgotten and put dressing on my salad, but I would not have eaten it anyway with that big white face watching. Jonas, who was not allowed chicken, sat on the floor beside my chair. "Does he always eat with you?" Charles asked once, nodding his head at Uncle Julian. "When he's well enough," Constance said. "I wonder how you stand it," Charles said. "I tell you, John," Uncle Julian said suddenly to Charles, "Investments are not what they were when Father made his money. He was a shrewd man, but he never understood that times change." "Who's he talking to?" Charles asked Constance. "He thinks you're his brother, John." Charles looked at Uncle Julian for a long minute, and then shook his head and returned to his chicken. "That was my dead wife's chair on your left, young man," Uncle Julian said. "I well recall the last time she sat there. None of that," Charles said, and shook his finger at Uncle Julian. He had been holding his chicken in his hand to eat it, and his fingers sparkled with grease. "We are not going to talk about it any more, Uncle." Constance was pleased with me because I had come to the table, and when I looked at her, she smiled at me. She knew that I disliked eating when anyone was watching me, and she would save my plate and bring it to me later in the kitchen. She did not remember, I saw, that she had put dressing on my salad. "Noticed this morning," Charles said, taking up the platter of chicken and looking into it carefully, "that there was a broken step out back. How about I fix it for you one of these days? I might as well earn my keep." "It would be very kind of you," Constance said. "That step has been a nuisance for a long time. And I want to run into the village to get some pipe tobacco, so I can pick up anything you need there." "But I go to the village on Tuesday," I said, startled. "You do?" He looked at me across the table, big white face turned directly at me. I was quiet. I remembered that walking to the village was the first step on Charles's way home. "Merricat, dear, I think if Charles doesn't mind, it might be a good idea. I never feel quite comfortable when you're away in the village." Constance laughed. "I'll give you a list, Charles, and the money, and you shall be the grocery boy." "You keep the money in the house?" "Of course." "Doesn't sound very wise." "It's in Father's safe." "Even so. I assure you, sir," Uncle Julian said, "I made a point of examining the books thoroughly before committing myself. I cannot have been deceived." "So I'm taking little cousin Mary's job away from her," Charles said, looking at me again. "You'll have to find something else for her to do, Connie." I had made sure of what to say to him before I came to the table. "The Amanita phalloides," I said to him, "holds 3 different poisons. There's amanitin, which works slowly and is most potent. There's phalloidin, which acts at once. And there's phalin, which dissolves red corpuscles, although it is the least potent. The first symptoms do not appear until 7 to 12 hours after eating. In some cases, not before 24 or even 40 hours. The symptoms begin with violent stomach pains, cold sweat, vomiting." "Listen," Charles said. He put his chicken down. "You stop that," he said. Constance was laughing. "Oh, Mary Cat," she said, laughing through her words. "You are silly." "I taught her," she told Charles, "that there are mushrooms by the creek and in the fields, and I made her learn the deadly ones. Oh, Mary Cat." "Death occurs between 5 and 10 days after eating," I said. "I don't think that's very funny," Charles said. "Silly Mary Cat," Constance said. Chapter 6. The house was not secure just because Charles had gone out of it and into the village. For one thing, Constance had given him a key to the gates. There had originally been a key for each of us. Our father had a key, our mother, and the keys were kept on a rack beside the kitchen door. When Charles started out for the village, Constance gave him a key. Perhaps our father's key, and a shopping list, and the money to pay for what he bought. You shouldn't keep money in the house like this, he said, holding it tight in his hand for a minute before he reached into a back pocket and took out a wallet. Women alone like you are, you shouldn't keep money in the house. I was watching him from the corner of the kitchen, but I would not let Jonas come to me while Charles was in the house. Are you sure you put everything down? He asked Constance. Hate to make 2 trips. I waited until Charles was well along, perhaps almost to the Black Rock, and then I said, he forgot the library books. Constance looked at me for a minute. Miss Wickedness, she said, you wanted him to forget. How could he know about the library books? He doesn't belong in this house. He has nothing to do with our books. Do you know, Constance said, looking into a pot on the stove, I think that soon we will be picking lettuce. The weather has stayed so warm. On the moon? I said, and then stopped. On the moon? Constance said, turning to smile at me. You have lettuce all year round, perhaps? On the moon, we have everything. Lettuce and pumpkin pie and amanita phalloides. We have cat-furred plants and horses dancing with their wings. All the locks are solid and tight, and there are no ghosts. On the moon, Uncle Julian would be well, and the sun would shine every day. You would wear our mother's pearls and sing, and the sun would shine all the time. I wish I could go to your moon. I wonder if we should start the gingerbread now. It won't be cold if Charles is late. I'll be here to eat it, I said. But Charles said he loved gingerbread. I was making a little house at the table, out of the library books, standing one across 2 set on edge. Old witch, I said, you have a gingerbread house. I do not, Constance said. I have a lovely house where I live with my sister Merricat. I laughed at her. She was worrying at the pot on the stove, and she had flour on her face. Maybe he'll never come back, I said. He has to. I'm making gingerbread for him. Since Charles had taken my occupation for Tuesday morning, I had nothing to do. I wondered about going down to the creek, but I had no reason to suppose that the creek would even be there, since I never visited it on Tuesday mornings. Would the people in the village be waiting for me, glancing from the corners of their eyes to see if I was coming, nudging one another, and then turn in astonishment when they saw Charles? Perhaps the whole village would falter and slow, bewildered at the lack of Miss Mary Katherine Blackwood. I giggled, thinking of Jim Donnell and the Harris boys peering anxiously up the road to see if I was coming. What's funny? Constance asked, turning to see me. I was thinking that you might make a gingerbread man, and I could name him Charles and eat him. Oh, Merricat, please. I could tell that Constance was going to be irritable, partly because of me, and partly because of the gingerbread, so I thought it wiser to run away. Since it was a free morning, and I was uneasy at going out of doors, it might be a good time to search out a device to use against Charles. And I started upstairs. The smell of baking gingerbread followed me almost halfway to the top. Charles had left his door open, not wide, but enough for me to get a hand inside. When I pushed a little, the door opened wide, and I looked at our father's room, which now belonged to Charles. Charles had made his bed, I noticed. His mother must have taught him. His suitcase was on a chair, but it was closed. There were things belonging to Charles on the dresser where our father's possessions had always been kept. I saw Charles's pipe and a handkerchief, things that Charles had touched and used dirtying our father's room. One drawer of the dresser was a little open, and I thought again of Charles, picking over our father's clothes. I walked very softly across the room, because I did not want Constance to hear me from downstairs. And I looked into the open drawer. I thought that Charles would not be pleased to know that I had caught him looking at our father's things, and something from this drawer might be extraordinarily powerful, since it would carry a guilt of Charles. I was not surprised to find that he had been looking at our father's jewelry. Inside the drawer was a leather box which held, I knew, a watch and chain made of gold and cufflinks, and a signet ring. I would not touch our mother's jewelry, but Constance had not said anything about father's jewelry, had not even come into his room to neaten, so I thought I could open the box and take something out. The watch was inside, in a small private box of its own, resting on a satin lining and not ticking. The watch chain was curled beside it. I would not touch the ring. The thought of a ring around my finger always made me feel tight, because rings had no openings to get out of, but I liked the watch chain, which twisted and wound around my hand when I picked it up. I put the jewelry box carefully back inside the drawer and closed the door and went out of the room and closed the door after me and took the watch chain into my room, where it curled again into a sleeping gold heap on the pillow. I had intended to bury it, but I was sorry when I thought how long it had been there in the darkness in the box in our father's drawer, and I thought that it had earned a place up high where it could sparkle in the sunlight, and I decided to nail it to the tree where the book had come down. While Constance made gingerbread in the kitchen, and Uncle Julian slept in his room, and Charles walked in and out of village stores, I lay on my bed and played with my golden chain.
"That's my brother's gold watch chain,"
Uncle Julian said, leaning forward curiously.
"I thought he was buried in it."
Charles's hand was shaking as he held it out. I could see it shaking against the yellow of the wall behind him. "In a tree," he said, and his voice was shaking too. "I found it nailed to a tree, for God's sake. What kind of a house is this?" "It's not important," Constance said. "Really, Charles, it's not important." "Not important, Connie. This thing's made of gold." "But no one wants it."
"One of the links is smashed," Charles said, mourning over the chain. "I could have worn it. What a hell of a way to treat a valuable thing. We could have sold it," he said to Constance.
"But why?"
"I certainly did think he was buried in it," Uncle Julian said. "He was never a man to give things away easily. I suppose he never knew they kept it from him."
"It's worth money," Charles said, explaining carefully to Constance. "This is a gold watch chain, worth possibly a good deal of money. Sensible people don't go around nailing this kind of valuable thing to trees. Lunch will be cold if you stand there worrying." "I'll take it up and put it back in the box where it belongs," Charles said. No one but me noticed that he knew where it had been kept. "Later," he said, looking at me, "we'll see how it got on the tree." "Merricat put it there," Constance said. "Please do come to lunch." "How do you know? About Mary?" "She always does." Constance smiled at me. "Silly Merricat." "Does she, indeed?" said Charles. He came slowly over to the table, looking at me.
"He was a man very fond of his person," Uncle Julian said, "given to adorning himself, and not overly clean."
It was quiet in the kitchen. Constance was in Uncle Julian's room, putting him to bed for his afternoon nap. "Where would poor Cousin Mary go if her sister turned her out?" Charles asked Jonas, who listened quietly. "What would poor Cousin Mary do if Constance and Charles didn't love her?" I cannot think why it seemed to me that I might simply ask Charles to go away. Perhaps I thought he had to be asked politely just once. Perhaps the idea of going away had just not come into his mind, and it was necessary to put it there. I decided that asking Charles to go away was the next thing to do. before he was everywhere in the house and could never be eradicated. Already the house smelled of him, of his pipe and his shaving lotion, and the noise of him echoed in the rooms all day long. His pipe was sometimes on the kitchen table, and his gloves or his tobacco pouch or his constant boxes of matches were scattered through our rooms. He walked into the village each afternoon and brought back newspapers which he left lying anywhere, even in the kitchen where Constance might see them. A spark from his pipe had left a tiny burn on the rose brocade of a chair in the drawing room. Constance had not yet noticed it. I thought not to tell her because I hoped that the house, injured, would reject him by itself. "Constance," I asked on a bright morning. Charles had been in our house for 3 days then, I thought. "Constance, has he said anything about leaving?" She was increasingly cross with me when I wanted Charles to leave. Always before, Constance had listened and smiled, and only been angry when Jonas and I had been wicked, but now she frowned at me often as though I somehow looked different to her. "I've told you," she said to me. "I've told you and told you that I won't hear any more silliness about Charles. He is our cousin and has been invited to visit us, and he will probably go when he is ready. He makes Uncle Julian sicker." He's only trying to keep Uncle Julian from thinking about sad things all the time. And I agree with him. Uncle Julian should be cheerful. "Why should he be cheerful if he's going to die?" "I haven't been doing my duty," Constance said. "I don't know what that means." "I've been hiding here," Constance said slowly, as though she were not at all sure of the correct order of the words. She stood by the stove in the sunlight with color in her hair and eyes, and not smiling. And she said slowly, "I have let Uncle Julian spend all his time living in the past, and particularly reliving that one dreadful day. I have let you run wild. How long has it been since you combed your hair?" I could not allow myself to be angry, and particularly not angry with Constance, but I wished Charles dead. Constance needed guarding more than ever before, and if I became angry and looked aside, she might very well be lost. I asked very cautiously, "On the moon?" "On the moon?" Constance said and laughed unpleasantly. "It's all been my fault," she said. "I didn't realize how wrong I was, letting things go on and on because I wanted to hide. It wasn't fair to you or to Uncle Julian." "And Charles is also mending the broken step?" "Uncle Julian should be in a hospital with nurses to take care of him. And you—" She opened her eyes wide suddenly, as though seeing her old Merricat again, and then she held her arms out to me. "Oh, Merricat," she said, and laughed a little. "Listen to me scolding you. How silly I am." I went to her and put my arms around her. "I love you, Constance." "You're a good child, Merricat," she said. That was when I left her and went outside to talk to Charles. I knew I would dislike talking to Charles, but it was almost too late to ask him politely, and I thought I should ask him once. Even the garden had become a strange landscape with Charles's figure in it. I could see him standing under the apple trees, and the trees were crooked and shortened beside him. I came out the kitchen door and walked slowly toward him. I was trying to think charitably of him, since I would never be able to speak kindly until I did. But whenever I thought of his big, white face grinning at me across the table, or watching me whenever I moved, I wanted to beat at him until he went away. I wanted to stamp on him after he was dead and see him lying dead on the grass. So I made my mind charitable towards Charles and came up to him slowly. "Cousin Charles," I said, and he turned to look at me. I thought of seeing him dead. "Cousin Charles?" "Well?" "I have decided to ask you, please, Just go away."
"All right," he said. "You asked me."
"Please, will you go away?"
"No," he said.
I could not think of anything further to say. I saw that he was wearing our father's gold watch chain, even with the crooked link, and I knew, without seeing, that our father's watch was in his pocket. I thought that tomorrow he would be wearing our father's signet ring, and I wonder if he would make Constance put on our mother's pearls. "You stay away from Jonas," I said.
"As a matter of fact," he said,
"come about a month from now, I wonder who will still be here."
"You," he said, "or me."
I ran back into the house and straight up to our father's room, where I hammered with a shoe at the mirror over the dresser until it cracked across. Then I went into my room and rested my head on the windowsill and slept. I was remembering those days to be kinder to Uncle Julian. I was sorry because he was spending more and more time in his room, taking both his breakfast and his lunch on a tray, and only eating his dinners in the dining room under the despising eye of Charles.
"Can't you feed him or something?" Charles asked Constance. "He's got food all over himself." "I didn't mean to," Uncle Julian said, looking at Constance. "Ought to wear a baby bib,"
Charles said, laughing. While Charles sat in the kitchen in the mornings, eating hugely of ham and potatoes and fried eggs and hot biscuits and doughnuts and toast, Uncle Julian drowsed in his room over his hot milk, and sometimes when he called to Constance, Charles said,
"Tell him you're busy. You don't have to go running every time he wets his bed. He just likes being waited on."
I always had my breakfast earlier than Charles on those sunny mornings, and if he came down before I finished, I would take my plate out and sit on the grass under the chestnut tree. Once I brought Uncle Julian a new leaf from the chestnut tree and put it on his windowsill. I stood outside in the sunlight and looked in at him, lying still in the dark room, and I tried to think of ways I could be kinder. I thought of him lying there alone, dreaming old Uncle Julian dreams, and I went into the kitchen and said to Constance, "Will you make Uncle Julian a little soft cake for his lunch?"
"She's too busy now," Charles said with his mouth full. "Your sister works like a slave."
"Will you?" I asked Constance. "I'm sorry," Constance said. "I have so much to do. But Uncle Julian's going to die."
"Constance is too busy," Charles said. "Run along and play."
I followed Charles one afternoon when he went to the village. I stopped by the Black Rock because it was not one of my days for going into the village, and watched Charles go down the main street. He stopped and talked for a minute to Stella, who was standing in the sunlight outside her shop, and he bought a paper. When I saw him sit down on the benches with the other men, I turned and went back to our house. If I went into the village shopping again, Charles would be one of the men who watched me going past. Constance was working in her garden, and Uncle Julian slept in the chair in the sun. And when I sat quietly on my bench, Constance asked, not looking up at me, "Where have you been, Merricat?" "Wandering. Where's my cat?" "I think," Constance said, "that we're going to have to forbid your wandering. It's time you quieted down a little." "Does we mean you and Charles?" "Merricat." Constance turned toward me, sitting back against her feet and folding her hands before her. "I never realized until lately how wrong I was to let you and Uncle Julian hide here with me. We should have faced the world and tried to live normal lives. Uncle Julian should have been in a hospital all these years with good care and nurses to watch him. We should have been living like other people. You should—" She stopped and waved her hands helplessly. "You should have boyfriends," she said finally, and then began to laugh because she sounded funny even to herself. "I have Jonas,"
I said, and we both laughed, and Uncle Julian woke up suddenly and laughed a thin old cackle. "You are the silliest person I ever saw," I told Constance, and went off to look for Jonas. While I was wandering, Charles came back to our house. He brought a newspaper and a bottle of wine for his dinner, and our father's scarf, which I had used to shut the gate, because Charles had a key. "I could have worn this scarf," he said irritably, and I heard him from the vegetable garden where I had found Jonas sleeping in a tangle of young lettuce plants. "It's an expensive thing, and I like the colors." "It belonged to father," Constance said. "That reminds me," Charles said. "One of these days I'd like to look over the rest of his clothes." He was quiet for a minute. I thought he was probably sitting down on my bench. Then he went on, very lightly. "Also," he said, "while I'm here, I ought to go over your father's papers. There might be something important." "Not my papers," Uncle Julian said. "That young man is not to put a finger on my papers." "I haven't even seen your father's study," Charles said. "We don't use it. Nothing in there's ever touched." "Except the safe, of course," Charles said. "Constance?" "Yes, Uncle Julian?" "I want you to have my papers afterwards. No one else has touched my papers. Do you hear me?" "Yes, Uncle Julian." I was not allowed to open the safe where Constance kept our father's money. I was allowed to go into the study, but I disliked it and never even touched the doorknob. I hoped Constance would not open the study for Charles. He already had our father's bedroom, after all, and our father's watch, and his gold chain, and his signet ring. I was thinking that being a demon and a ghost must be very difficult, even for Charles. If he ever forgot or let his disguise drop for a minute, he would be recognized at once and driven away. He must be extremely careful to use the same voice every time and present the same face and the same manner without a slip. He must be constantly on guard against betraying himself. I wondered if he would turn back to his true form when he was dead. When it grew cooler, and I knew that Constance would be taking Uncle Julian indoors, I left Jonas asleep on the lettuce plants and came back into the house. When I came into the kitchen, Uncle Julian was poking furiously at the papers on his table, trying to get them into a small heap, and Constance was peeling potatoes. I could hear Charles moving around upstairs, and for a minute the kitchen was warm and glowing and bright. "Jonas is asleep in the lettuce," I said. "There is nothing I like more than cat fur in my salad," Constance said amiably. "It is time that I had a box," Uncle Julian announced. He sat back and looked angrily at his papers. "They must all be put in a box this very minute. Constance?" "Yes, Uncle Julian, I can find you a box." "If I put all my papers in a box and put the box in my room, then that dreadful young man cannot touch them. He is a dreadful young man, Constance." "Really, Uncle Julian? Charles is very kind." "He is dishonest. His father was dishonest. Both my brothers were dishonest. If he tries to take my papers, you must stop him. I cannot permit tampering with my papers, and I will not tolerate intrusion. You must tell him this, Constance. He is a bastard." "Uncle Julian." "In a purely metaphorical sense, I assure you. Both my brothers married women of very strong will. That is merely a word used among men, my dear. I apologize for submitting you to such a word, to categorize an undesirable fellow." Constance turned without speaking and opened the door which led to the cellar stairs and to the rows and rows of food preserved at the very bottom of our house. She went quietly down the stairs, and we could hear Charles moving upstairs and Constance moving downstairs. "William of Orange was a bastard," Uncle Julian said to himself. He took up a bit of paper and made a note. Constance came back up the cellar stairs with a box which she brought to Uncle Julian. "Here's a clean box," she said. "What for?" Uncle Julian asked. "To put your papers in." "That young man is not to touch my papers, Constance. I will not have that young man going through my papers."
This is all my fault, Constance said, turning to me. He should be in a hospital.
I will put my papers in that box, Constance, my dear, if you will be kind enough to hand it to me.
He has a happy time, I said to Constance. I should have done everything differently. It would certainly not be kind to put Uncle Julian in a hospital. But I'll have to if I... And Constance stopped suddenly and turned back to the sink and the potatoes. Shall I put walnuts in the applesauce? She asked. I sat very quietly, listening to what she had almost said. Time was running shorter, tightening around our house, crushing me. I thought it might be time to smash the big mirror in the hall, but then Charles's feet were coming heavily down the stairs and through the hall and into the kitchen. Well, well, everybody's here, he said. What's for dinner? That evening, Constance played for us in the drawing room, the tall curve of her harp making shadows against our mother's portrait, and the soft notes falling into the air like petals. She played Over the Sea to Sky and Flow Gently, Sweet Afton, and I Saw a Lady, and other songs our mother used to play. But I never remembered that our mother's fingers touched the strings so lightly, with such a breath of melody. Uncle Julian kept himself awake, listening and dreaming, and even Charles did not quite dare to put his feet on the furniture in the drawing room, although the smoke from his pipe drifted against the wedding cake ceiling, and he moved restlessly while Constance played. A delicate touch, Uncle Julian said once.
All the Blackwood women had a gifted touch.
Charles dropped by the fireplace to knock his pipe against the grate.
Pretty,
he said, taking down one of the Dresden figurines. Constance stopped playing, and he turned to look at her.
Valuable?
Not particularly, Constance said. My mother liked them. Uncle Julian said,
My particular favorite was always Bluebells of Scotland. Constance, my dear, would you? No more now, Charles said. Now, Constance and I want to talk, Uncle. We've got plans to make.